There's a reason you keep making the same mistakes over and over again, despite promising yourself you won't. The same toxic relationships, the same self-sabotage right before success, the same destructive patterns that seem to have a life of their own. Carl Jung discovered exactly why this happens, and the one thing you must change to break these cycles permanently. You've experienced this, choosing partners who hurt you in familiar ways, sabotaging opportunities just as they were about to pay off, reacting with the same anger, the same fear, the same behaviors you swore you'd never repeat. It feels like something else is driving your choices, and Jung proved that something else actually is. What if the decisions you think are yours aren't really coming from you? What if there are ancient psychological forces operating beneath your awareness, making you repeat patterns that feel completely beyond your control? Carl Gustav Jung spent decades mapping these hidden forces within human consciousness. He discovered that what feels like personal choice is often unconscious programming, archetypal patterns, shadow projections, and inherited psychological blueprints that have been running your life since childhood. Carl Gustav Jung emerged as psychology's most daring explorer, refusing to limit his investigation to symptom management or social adjustment. Born into 19th century Switzerland's atmosphere of religious symbolism and cultural mystery, he developed early sensitivity to dimensions of human experience that transcended rational explanation. Unlike his contemporaries, who sought to reduce psychological complexity to manageable formulas, Jung chose to embrace the psyche's full paradoxical nature. While Sigmund Freud focused on repressed sexual content as the primary driver of unconscious behavior, Jung perceived far deeper currents, archetypal patterns, mythological structures, and collective psychological inheritances that connected individual experience to humanity's entire developmental history. This fundamental difference in vision created inevitable rupture between mentor and student. Freud's mechanistic approach could not contain Jung's recognition that the human psyche operates according to principles that transcend personal biography. Where Freud saw individual pathology, Jung discovered universal patterns. Where Freud found repressed content, Jung encountered living symbolic systems that linked contemporary consciousness to ancestral wisdom. Jung's analytical psychology emerged from this expanded understanding, a framework that honors psychological symptoms as meaningful communications rather than mere dysfunctions. He recognized that human suffering often signals disconnection from essential aspects of the self, rather than indicating fundamental brokenness requiring repair. This perspective revolutionized therapeutic practice by shifting focus from pathology elimination to consciousness expansion. Instead of teaching individuals to suppress problematic aspects of their nature, Jung's approach encourages integration of all psychological material, light and shadow, rational and emotional, masculine and feminine, into a more complete sense of identity. His work anticipated the spiritual crisis of modernity with uncanny precision, recognizing that technological advancement without corresponding psychological development would create unprecedented forms of human suffering. Contemporary anxiety, depression, and existential emptiness validate Jung's prediction that societies obsessed with external achievement while ignoring inner development inevitably produce widespread psychological fragmentation. Beneath the personal unconscious, that repository of individual memories and traumas, Jung discovered a deeper psychological layer that belongs not to the individual, but to the human species itself. Think of it as humanity's shared psychological inheritance. This collective unconscious contains archetypal patterns and symbolic structures that have emerged consistently across cultures and historical periods. These aren't learned behaviors. They're built into human psychology like instincts. This discovery fundamentally challenges the assumption that psychological content comes solely from personal experience. Instead, human beings inherit predispositions towards specific patterns of perception and behavior that existed long before individual birth. Why do certain stories resonate universally? Why do the same symbols, the hero's journey, the wise elder, the great mother, appear in myths across unconnected cultures? Because these archetypal figures emerge from humanity's shared psychological blueprint. Understanding the collective unconscious illuminates why individuals often feel driven by forces they cannot identify or control. The person struggling with authority issues may be unconsciously enacting the eternal rebellion against the father archetype. The individual trapped in caretaking relationships might be possessed by the great mother pattern. The chronic underachiever could be avoiding the terror and responsibility of heroic potential. These archetypal influences operate with particular intensity during periods of psychological crisis or transition, when personal identity structures begin dissolving through loss, failure, or natural developmental phases. The collective unconscious becomes more accessible, often flooding consciousness with symbolic material that can either overwhelm or guide toward transformation. Jung emphasized that ignoring these deeper psychological currents resembles attempting to ignore gravitational force. The archetypal patterns continue operating whether recognized or not, often manifesting as compulsive behaviors, repetitive relationship patterns, or inexplicable emotional reactions that seem disproportionate to current circumstances. Within the collective unconscious operate what Jung termed archetypes, universal patterns of human experience that function like psychological instincts. These archetypal forces shape how individuals interpret and respond to existence, often without conscious awareness. What does this look like in practice? The hero archetype drives the person who constantly seeks challenges and measures worth through achievement. Think of the workaholic who can't rest, the person always taking on everyone else's problems. When this pattern dominates, it creates grandiosity and addiction to conflict. The sage represents the quest for wisdom and truth. These individuals prioritize knowledge over everything else. The professor who lives in their head, the person who uses intelligence to avoid emotional connection. Its shadow creates intellectual arrogance and emotional disconnection. The caregiver embodies nurturing and service to others. This shows up as the parent who neglects their health while obsessively helping adult children, or the friend who's always available for everyone else's crises. The shadow creates martyrdom complexes and complete neglect of personal needs. The revolutionary seeks to overthrow existing structures. These are the people always fighting the system, unable to build anything stable. They're attracted to chaos and perpetually dissatisfied with any established order. Jung emphasized that psychological health requires conscious relationship with multiple archetypal patterns rather than unconscious possession by any single archetype. When individuals identify completely with one archetypal role, they lose access to the full spectrum of human possibility while becoming enslaved to that pattern's compulsive demands. The goal of psychological development involves recognizing these internal forces, understanding their legitimate functions, and learning to engage their energies consciously rather than being driven by their unconscious demands. Among all archetypal forces, none proves more crucial than the shadow, the aspect of personality containing everything individuals refuse to acknowledge about themselves. Your anger, selfishness, neediness, vanity, cruelty, all the traits you've learned are unacceptable. This psychological repository forms through early conditioning. The spontaneous child learns to suppress natural assertiveness to avoid punishment. The sensitive individual develops armor against vulnerability to prevent hurt. The creative spirit learns to conform to practical expectations. But the shadow doesn't disappear through repression. These disowned aspects continue operating from unconsciousness, manifesting as psychological symptoms, relationship conflicts, or self-sabotage that seems to come from nowhere. The shadow reveals itself most clearly through projection, seeing in others what you refuse to see in yourself. The person who strongly condemns aggression in others may be avoiding their own capacity for healthy anger. The individual who judges others' selfishness might be denying their own legitimate needs. Here's why this matters. You end up fighting external battles against qualities that actually exist within yourself. This explains why certain people trigger disproportionate reactions, why specific behaviors provoke unusual intensity of judgment. Shadow integration requires the courage to recognize and reclaim these rejected aspects of personality. This process involves acknowledging that the qualities most vigorously condemned in others likely exist, in some form, within the self. Rather than destroying these shadow elements, the goal involves understanding their function and learning to express them consciously rather than compulsively. The integrated shadow becomes a source of vitality, authenticity, and personal power. The reclaimed anger provides capacity for appropriate boundaries. The acknowledged selfishness enables healthy self-care. The accepted darkness adds depth and substance to otherwise superficial personality structures. Jung warned that individuals who refuse shadow integration remain vulnerable to unconscious possession by these rejected forces, often at moments of greatest personal importance. The person who has never acknowledged their capacity for cruelty may find themselves acting with unexpected harshness during crisis. The individual who denies their need for recognition might sabotage achievements to avoid the discomfort of being seen. Jung identified individuation as the central task of human development. What does this mean? It's the process of becoming conscious of your complete psychological nature and learning to express your authentic essence rather than conforming to external expectations. This journey requires dismantling the persona, the social mask you wear to gain acceptance. Think of the perfect employee who never expresses their real opinions, or the people pleaser who's lost touch with their actual desires. The persona serves necessary functions, but problems arise when you mistake this mask for your essential identity. Individuation begins with recognizing that the personality you present to the world represents only a fragment of who you are. This realization often emerges during crisis, divorce, job loss, illness, when your existing identity proves inadequate to life's demands. What does holding the tension of opposites mean? It's learning to embrace contradictory aspects of your personality without trying to resolve them. You can be both strong and vulnerable, both independent and connected, both confident and uncertain. The individuated person doesn't become perfect or problem-free. Instead, They develop the capacity to remain conscious during psychological challenges rather than falling into unconscious reactions. They learn to approach difficulties as opportunities for growth rather than evidence of personal failure. While modern culture tends to dismiss dreams as neurological static or random memory processing, Jung recognized them as communications from the unconscious mind, attempting to restore psychological balance and provide guidance for conscious development. Dreams operate through symbolic language rather than literal representation, requiring interpretation that honors their metaphorical rather than concrete meaning. This symbolic dimension connects dream content to the broader archetypal patterns residing in the collective unconscious, making individual dreams potentially relevant for understanding universal human themes. Jung observed that dreams often compensate for one-sided conscious attitudes by presenting images that balance or challenge existing psychological positions. The person overly identified with rational thinking might dream of flooding waters representing the emotions being ignored. The individual who avoids conflict could encounter dream scenarios requiring courage and assertiveness. This compensatory function suggests that dreams serve regulatory purposes within the psyche, similar to how physical symptoms signal bodily imbalance. Rather than dismissing disturbing dreams as meaningless, Jung encouraged viewing them as important communications about psychological states requiring attention. Common dream symbols carry archetypal significance that transcends personal association. Houses often represent the dreamer's psychological structure, with different rooms corresponding to various aspects of personality. Water frequently symbolizes emotional or unconscious content. Animals may represent instinctual energies that need integration. Death typically signifies transformation rather than literal mortality. However, Jung emphasized that symbol interpretation must consider the dreamer's personal associations and current life circumstances rather than relying solely on universal meanings. The same symbol might carry different significance for different individuals based on their unique psychological constellation and developmental needs. Recurring dreams or persistent symbolic themes often indicate archetypal content attempting to reach consciousness. These repetitive patterns suggest that the unconscious continues attempting communication until the conscious mind recognizes and responds to the message being conveyed. Jung encouraged individuals to maintain dream journals, recording not only dream content, but also emotional responses and potential connections to waking life circumstances. This practice develops symbolic literacy, the capacity to recognize meaningful patterns within the psyche's symbolic productions. Understanding dream language provides access to wisdom that exceeds rational analysis, offering guidance for navigating complex life decisions and understanding psychological dynamics that remain hidden from ordinary consciousness. The psychological insights Jung developed decades ago prove remarkably prescient for understanding contemporary mental health challenges and social dysfunction. His recognition that technological advancement without corresponding psychological development would create unprecedented forms of human suffering accurately describes current cultural conditions. Modern society's emphasis on external achievement, social media performance, and material accumulation directly correlates with the persona identification Jung warned against. Individuals increasingly live as curated versions of themselves, losing contact with authentic desires, emotions, and creative potentials in favor of managing public image and meeting external expectations. The epidemic of anxiety, depression, and existential emptiness that characterizes contemporary life reflects what Jung termed loss of soul, disconnection from the deeper psychological sources that provide meaning, purpose, and vitality. When individuals become alienated from their archetypal nature, symbolic awareness, and unconscious wisdom, they experience the specific form of suffering that no external solution can address. Social media culture particularly amplifies shadow projection dynamics, creating endless opportunities for individuals to condemn in others the qualities they refuse to acknowledge within themselves. Political polarization, cultural conflict, and interpersonal drama often reflect collective shadow projection rather than genuine ideological differences. The rise of fundamentalism across various domains, religious, political, scientific, demonstrates what Jung called possession by archetypal content on a mass scale. When individuals become unconsciously identified with archetypal patterns without recognizing their psychological nature, these patterns manifest as fanaticism, rigidity, and inability to tolerate alternative perspectives. Jung's emphasis on individuation offers an antidote to contemporary conformity pressures while providing framework for developing authentic identity in an increasingly complex world. His insights about shadow integration prove essential for addressing personal dysfunction and contributing to social healing, rather than perpetuating collective unconsciousness. The therapeutic applications of Jungian psychology focus on symptom understanding rather than symptom elimination, helping individuals recognize the meaningful communication within psychological distress, rather than simply managing discomfort through medication or behavioral modification. Contemporary applications of Jung's work include depth psychotherapy, dream analysis, active imagination techniques, and creative expression modalities that honor the psyche's symbolic dimension. These approaches prove particularly effective for individuals whose suffering stems from spiritual or existential crisis rather than specific trauma or biochemical imbalance. The encounter with Jung's psychology represents more than academic study. It constitutes an invitation to embark upon the most challenging and rewarding journey available to human consciousness, the discovery of one's authentic nature through conscious engagement with the psyche's hidden depths. This path requires abandoning comfortable illusions about personal identity, accepting responsibility for unconscious patterns, and developing the courage to face aspects of the self that have been carefully avoided. The process involves what Jung called voluntary suffering, choosing conscious engagement with psychological difficulty rather than unconscious avoidance of personal growth opportunities. Individuals drawn to this work often experience what Jung termed the call, a persistent sense that conventional approaches to living fail to address deeper questions about meaning, purpose, and authentic expression. This call typically intensifies during periods of transition, loss, or crisis, when existing identity structures prove inadequate to life's demands. The journey toward consciousness begins with honest self-examination, particularly regarding the patterns that create recurring difficulties in relationships, work, and personal satisfaction. Rather than blaming external circumstances or other people for these patterns, depth psychology encourages investigation of their internal origins and psychological functions. Dream work provides a practical entry point for developing relationship with unconscious content, recording dreams, exploring their symbolic meanings, and noticing recurring themes gradually develops the capacity to recognize and respond to guidance from beyond ego consciousness. Shadow integration requires the humility to acknowledge personal qualities that conflict with idealized self-image, while developing compassion for the human struggle to balance competing psychological forces. This work involves recognizing projections onto others and gradually reclaiming the disowned aspects of personality they represent. Active imagination techniques allow direct dialogue with archetypal figures and symbolic images that emerge from the unconscious, providing access to wisdom and guidance that transcends rational analysis. These practices require patience and respect for the psyche's symbolic language rather than demanding literal answers to complex questions. The path of individuation extends throughout life, offering endless opportunities for growth, discovery, and authentic expression. Rather than promising easy solutions or quick fixes, Jung's approach honors the complexity of human nature while providing reliable methods for navigating psychological development with consciousness and courage. The exploration of Carl Jung's psychology ultimately confronts each individual with a fundamental choice: whether to remain unconscious of the deeper forces shaping existence, or to undertake the demanding but liberating journey toward psychological awareness and authentic self-expression. This choice cannot be made casually or reversed easily. Once consciousness begins expanding to include previously unconscious material, the comfortable illusions that sustain surface-level living become increasingly untenable. The persona's protective function weakens as authentic personality seeks expression. Shadow projections become obvious, requiring acknowledgement of personal responsibility for previously externalized conflicts. Yet this dissolution of psychological defenses creates space for something far more substantial: genuine relationship with the deeper self that provides lasting meaning, purpose, and creative vitality. The individuated person discovers sources of satisfaction that transcend external circumstances while developing capacity to contribute meaningfully to human consciousness evolution. The modern world desperately needs individuals willing to undertake this psychological work, not only for personal healing, but for collective transformation. Jung recognized that social change emerges through individual consciousness development rather than through external manipulation of systems and structures. Each person who chooses consciousness over unconsciousness, authenticity over conformity, integration over projection, contributes to humanity's psychological evolution. These individuals become what Jung called carriers of new consciousness, living examples of human potential that inspire others to embark upon their own journeys towards psychological wholeness. The path requires no special talents or circumstances, only willingness to engage honestly with one's complete psychological nature and patience to allow authentic identity to emerge through conscious relationship with the psyche's hidden wisdom. Jung's legacy offers tools, insights, and encouragement for this essential work, while honoring the unique expression each individual brings to the universal human project of consciousness development. The archetypal patterns provide guidance, but the specific manifestation remains eternally creative, personal, and unprecedented. The invitation stands before every human being to remain asleep to the deeper dimensions of existence, or to awaken to the profound mystery and creative potential of conscious living. The choice, as always, determines not only individual destiny, but the future of human consciousness itself.